The mistake usually happens in under 10 seconds. A drawer gets emptied, a jewelry box gets flipped, and one small stone, dull, scratched, nothing special, gets dropped into a donation pile. Not because it's fake, not because it's ugly, but because it looks too ordinary to matter. And that's how Americans have quietly thrown away gemstones that later became valuable, sometimes worth hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes more, only after the market, the science, or the story finally caught up. Today, we're counting down 10 stones Americans tossed aside before they were understood, misread as cheap, misnamed, or sold too early. And as you watch, keep one thing in mind. Which stone do you think people regret throwing away the most? Don't wait until the end. Drop your guess in the comments now and see if you were right. Let's start at number 10. Ranked 10th, Smoky Quartz, the stone. Americans threw away because it didn't shine. A dark brown stone, no shine, no sparkle, just heavy enough to feel real and plain enough to be ignored. Not because it was rare, but because it didn't look like it was worth keeping. Dark, brown, sometimes almost black. Rough pieces with cloudy interiors and no sparkle at all. To most people, it looked like a failed crystal, the kind you pick up once, then quietly put back down. And that's exactly why so many of them were thrown away. In the 1970s and 80s, quartz was everywhere in the US. Clear quartz was sold as pure. Amethyst was pretty. Citrine was bright. But smoky quartz? It didn't glow. It didn't flash. It didn't perform. So when people cleaned out old drawers, moved houses, or downsized after retirement, smoky quartz was usually the first to go. It looked dirty. It looked unfinished. It looked like the wrong color. Here's the part most people didn't know at the time. Natural smoky quartz gets its color from radiation deep underground, over geological time. Not dye, not heat treatment, not enhancement. The darker, deeper pieces, especially rough, unpolished ones, often came from older formations, exposed longer to natural radiation. But visually, they failed the one test that mattered in everyday American life. They didn't look special, so they were tossed. What changed wasn't the stone, it was the market's patience. As collectors became more careful, a distinction emerged that most people never noticed back then. Natural smoky quartz versus artificially darkened quartz. Many of the stones sold cheaply in later decades were irradiated on purpose. Fast, shallow color, uniform tone. The old rough pieces, they weren't uniform. They weren't clean. And that irregularity became the proof. Collectors started paying attention to depth, zoning, and internal structure. The very things people once thought were flaws became the indicators of authenticity. Suddenly, stones that had been ignored for decades were being reevaluated, not because they were flashy, but because they were honest. Today, deep, natural, smoky quartz, especially large, rough specimens with stable color, is actively collected, not for jewelry counters, for private collections. And here's the uncomfortable part. A lot of those pieces didn't come from mines. They came from American homes, from drawers that were cleaned out, from garages that were emptied, from stones people thought were just old quartz. Smoky quartz didn't become valuable because it changed. It became valuable because people finally stopped expecting it to shine. And that's why it belongs on this list. Not because it was fake, not because experts were wrong, but because ordinary people didn't think something quiet was worth keeping. So here's the question I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever thrown something away because it didn't look special, only to realize later that it was exactly what collectors were looking for? Ranked 9th. Jet. The stone Americans threw away because it looked like plastic. Everyone thought they knew what this was because it looked exactly like plastic. It got thrown into junk boxes, black brooches, heavy necklaces, matte rings that didn't shine under light. To most people, they looked cheap, old-fashioned, almost fake. And when families cleaned out drawers after a move, a downsizing, or a funeral, jet was usually dismissed with a single thought: this is just plastic. That assumption sent thousands of real jet pieces into thrift stores, garage sales, in trash bags across the U.S. Here's why. Jet doesn't sparkle. It doesn't reflect light like onyx or obsidian. It absorbs it. To modern eyes trained on gloss and brilliance, jet feels wrong. Flat, soft, almost unfinished. But jet was never meant to impress. It was meant to mean something. During the Victorian era, jet became the material of mourning. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria wore jet almost exclusively for decades. That decision reshaped fashion across Europe and eventually the United States. Jet jewelry wasn't decorative. It was intentional. Its deep black color symbolized grief, restraint, and permanence. Its matte surface avoided attention. Its weight reminded the wearer that loss was being carried, not hidden. But when those pieces crossed generations, the meaning didn't survive. What survived was the look, and the look confused people. By the mid-20th century, black plastic jewelry flooded the market. Bakelite, early synthetics, cheap costume pieces designed to imitate darker stones. Jet and plastic began sharing the same fate, especially to untrained eyes. So Americans did what they often do with unfamiliar heirlooms. They let them go. What most people didn't realize is that real jet isn't plastic at all. It's fossilized wood. Ancient trees, buried under pressure, transformed over millions of years into a dense organic gemstone. True Whitby jet, the most collectible kind, formed under conditions that no longer exist. Once it's gone, it's gone. As collectors began re-examining Victorian jewelry, jet quietly returned, not to fashion counters, but to historical and collector circles. Weight mattered, temperature mattered, tool marks mattered, and suddenly pieces that had been tossed aside for decades were being recognized for what they were: culturally specific, finite, and irreplaceable. Jet didn't become valuable because it changed. It became valuable because people remembered what it was for. And here's the part that stings. Most jet pieces didn't disappear in museums. They disappeared in American homes, thrown away during cleanouts, sold cheaply at estate sales, mistaken for something modern and disposable. Jet belongs on this list because it exposes a quiet truth. When meaning is lost, value often follows. Once it left the house, it never came back. Not because it was worthless, but because its meaning was already forgotten. Ranked 8th, turquoise, the stone. Americans threw away because it looked worn out. The moment the color faded, the decision felt obvious. It was treated like a souvenir. Bracelets from road trips, necklaces bought near the desert, rings picked up decades ago and worn until the color changed. And when that change happened, when the surface turned dull, pale, or chalky, most people assumed the same thing. It's ruined. So they stopped wearing it. Then they stopped keeping it. And eventually they let it go. Across American homes, chalky turquoise ended up in donation boxes, garage sales, and old jewelry jars labeled broken. Here's why that mistake happened. Modern jewelry culture trains people to expect permanence, shine that stays, color that doesn't move. Turquoise breaks that rule. Natural turquoise is porous. It absorbs oils, sweat, and the environment around it. Over time, especially when worn close to the skin, its color shifts. Blues soften, greens emerge, surfaces lose polish. To modern eyes, that looks like damage, but to collectors, it looks like proof. Before stabilization became common, most turquoise was left untreated. No resin, no hardening, no color locking. The stone aged naturally, responding to the life of the person wearing it. And those older, untreated pieces behave differently. They don't stay glossy. They don't stay uniform. They change. For decades, Americans threw those pieces away because they thought something had gone wrong. What they didn't realize is that the chalky texture was often the sign of authenticity. As stabilized turquoise flooded the market, something unexpected happened. The stones that didn't hold up, the ones that softened and weathered, became harder to find. Collectors started paying attention to matrix patterns, softness, and color variation. They learned how to distinguish natural wear from artificial treatment. And suddenly, the pieces people had ignored were the ones being searched for. Especially turquoise connected to older American craftsmanship. Southwest silverwork, early Native American settings, mid-century handmade jewelry, stones that were never meant to look new forever. Turquoise didn't lose value because it aged. It gained value because it aged honestly. Here's the part most people don't like to hear. A huge amount of authentic, untreated turquoise never made it to collectors. It was thrown away. Not because it was fake, not because it was worthless, but because it didn't look the way people expected gemstones to behave. Turquoise belongs on this list because it exposes a very American mistake, confusing wear with failure. Some stones aren't supposed to stay perfect. They're supposed to record time. And when we mistake that record for damage, value disappears quietly, one jewelry box at a time. When untreated turquoise became scarce, the pieces people discarded were suddenly the ones collectors wanted most. Ranked 7th, Spinel, the stone Americans threw away. Because the label said garnet, you would have sold this without checking, because the label told you to. Not because it looked bad, not because it was damaged, but because of one small word written on a tag. Garnet. For decades, anything red that wasn't a ruby was casually labeled the same way. Garnet meant common, affordable, replaceable. So when people inherited old rings, cleaned out drawers, or sorted through estate jewelry, the decision felt easy. This is just garnet. And just like that, Spinel was sold cheap or thrown away entirely. Here's why that mistake was so common. Spinel doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show obvious color change. It doesn't sparkle aggressively. To the untrained eye, it behaves quietly. Clean color, stable tone, no drama. That calm appearance worked against it. In American jewelry culture, value has often been associated with familiarity. Ruby is valuable. Sapphire is valuable. Diamond is valuable. Everything else becomes something like. Spinel was the victim of that thinking. For much of the 20th century, even professional jewelers grouped Spinel with garnet by default. The stones shared similar colors, similar sizes, similar settings. And once a stone is labeled garnet, it stops being questioned. So families sold them in bulk. Pawn shops priced them low. Collectors walked past them. The irony is that Spinel is often harder, cleaner, and more stable than many garnets. Its color is intrinsic, not enhanced, not altered. Red Spinel doesn't fade. Blue Spinel doesn't cloud. The stone holds exactly what nature gave it, but none of that mattered if the name was wrong. What changed wasn't Spinel itself. It was attention. As collectors began revisiting older jewelry, especially pieces from the early and mid-1900s, they started testing stones that had been ignored for decades, and something uncomfortable surfaced. Some of the cheap garnets weren't garnet at all. They were Spinel. Suddenly, stones that had been dismissed for generations were being reclassified, not as mistakes, but as missed opportunities. Values shifted quietly. Demand followed. And the supply? It was already gone, because Spinel had spent decades being thrown away under the wrong name. Here's the part that hits hardest. Most Spinel didn't disappear because it was unattractive. It disappeared because people trusted labels instead of looking twice. Jewelry boxes were emptied, estate lots were cleared, stones were sold off in groups, all because no one questioned what they were told. Spinel belongs on this list because it represents one of the most common American errors. Assuming value is obvious. Sometimes the difference between something ordinary and something valuable isn't appearance. It's accuracy. By the time the name changed, most of the stones were already gone. Have you ever ignored or let go of something just because someone told you it wasn't special? Ranked 6th. Unheated Zircon. The stone Americans threw away because it sounded fake. Most of these were already gone before anyone realized what they were. Say it out loud and most people immediately think of something else. Something cheap, something artificial. Cubic zirconia. So when Americans came across older rings labeled Zircon, the reaction was almost automatic. They didn't inspect it. They didn't question it. They didn't keep it. They assumed it was fake and moved on. That single misunderstanding sent countless real gemstones out of American homes. Here's how it happened. Unheated zircon was widely used in jewelry long before cubic zirconia existed. In the early and mid-20th century, zircon was valued for its brilliance, fire, and natural range of colors: honey, champagne, pale blue, even warm reds. But language caught up with it in the worst way. When cubic zirconia entered the market decades later, the name alone reshaped perception. Zircon became shorthand for imitation, even though the two materials are completely different. And once that association formed, it stuck. So when families cleaned out jewelry boxes, estate lots, or inherited collections, zircon was treated like costume jewelry. This isn't real. This is just CZ. This isn't worth keeping. And just like that, real stones were sold cheap or thrown away. What most people didn't realize is that unheated zircon behaves very differently from its synthetic namesake. It has natural inclusions. It shows subtle color zoning. It carries weight and fire that doesn't look manufactured. And most importantly, unheated zircon reflects a kind of brilliance that modern stones rarely match. Sharp, lively, and unmistakably natural once you know what to look for. But for decades, Americans didn't look. They trusted the stigma. As sapphire prices rose and collectors began searching for overlooked alternatives, zircon quietly returned to attention. Not as a substitute, but as its own gemstone with a distinct identity. Unheated blue zircon, in particular, became desirable not because it tried to mimic anything, but because it didn't. Collectors learned to separate heat-treated stones from natural color examples. They began valuing older cuts, early settings, and stones that hadn't been improved. And suddenly, the pieces people had dismissed were the ones being searched for. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Zircon didn't disappear because it lacked beauty. It disappeared because it shared a name with something else. American homes didn't lose zircon to fashion trends or expert opinion. They lost it to assumption. Jewelry was cleared out. Stones were sold in bulk. Real gems left behind. All because no one paused to ask what zircon actually meant. Unheated zircon belongs on this list because it represents one of the most damaging mistakes people make with value. Judging something by what it sounds like instead of what it is. Sometimes a gemstone isn't thrown away because it looks wrong. It's thrown away because its name carries the wrong story. They sold this one early. The next stone wasn't sold. It was ignored. Ranked 5th. Chrysoberyl. The stone Americans threw away because it looked too normal. Soft yellow, clean surface. Nothing about it asked for attention. They're familiar, comfortable, easy to name. Citrine. So when people inherited old rings, sorted through estate jewelry, or cleaned out drawers, the process felt simple. Yellow stone? Must be citrine. Not rare, not worth holding on to. And that assumption quietly erased chrysoberyl from countless American homes. Here's why it happened. Chrysoberyl doesn't advertise itself. Its color is restrained. Soft yellow, greenish gold, sometimes with a subtle olive tone. It doesn't sparkle loudly. It doesn't shout for attention. Compared to modern, brightly colored stones, chrysoberyl feels almost polite. And in a culture trained to equate value with saturation and brightness, polite often gets ignored. For decades, jewelers themselves reinforced the mistake. Anything yellow that wasn't obviously sapphire or diamond was casually labeled citrine. The name became a shortcut, not a diagnosis. So families trusted it. They sold pieces cheaply. They donated them. They tossed them into mixed lots. No one thought twice because citrine is common. What they didn't realize is that chrysoberyl is a completely different gemstone. Harder, denser, and far rarer than citrine. It forms under specific geological conditions and doesn't appear in large quantities. But visually, it didn't fight for recognition. And that was the problem. As collectors began re-examining vintage jewelry, something odd kept happening. Stones labeled citrine weren't behaving like citrine. Their refractive qualities were different. Their durability didn't match. Their color held steady in ways citrine often doesn't. Slowly, the mistake surfaced. Some of those ordinary yellow stones were chrysoberyl, and once the name changed, everything else followed. Prices shifted. Demand followed quietly. Supply didn't. Because most Chrysoberyl had already been let go, decades earlier, under the wrong label. Here's the part that hurts. Chrysoberyl wasn't thrown away because it looked cheap. It was thrown away because it looked too normal. It didn't feel rare. It didn't feel special. It didn't demand attention. So Americans assumed it wasn't worth keeping. Jewelry boxes were emptied. Estate collections were cleared. Stones passed through hands without anyone realizing what they were holding. Chrysoberyl belongs on this list because it exposes one of the most dangerous habits people have with value, assuming that rarity announces itself. Sometimes the most valuable thing in the box is the one that doesn't stand out at all. It never looked rare enough to protect, until rarity finally mattered. Ranked fourth, Andalusite, the stone Americans threw away because it looked ordinary at first glance. Someone picked it up once, glanced at it under bad light, and put it back. They get glanced at. A ring comes out of a box. Someone holds it up under a ceiling light. Looks brown, looks dull, looks fine. Andalusite often died right there, at first glance. It wasn't flashy. It didn't glow. It didn't sparkle the way people expected valuable stones to sparkle. So it was ignored, then dismissed, then quietly let go. Across the U.S., Andalusite passed through hands the same way again and again. Old rings, inherited pendants, vintage pieces with stones that never stood out in photographs or display cases. Because Andalusite breaks one unspoken rule of modern jewelry culture, it doesn't reveal itself all at once. Under one light, it can look brownish or greenish. Under another, it shifts toward gold, olive, or even red. But most people never saw that. They saw it once, under bad lighting, and made up their mind. This isn't anything special, so they sold it cheaply. They donated it. They tossed it into mixed lots with other forgotten stones. What they didn't realize is that Andalusite is pleochroic, meaning it shows different colors depending on angle and light direction. Not dramatically like alexandrite, but subtly, quietly, and that subtlety costed everything. In American homes, jewelry is rarely evaluated under controlled light. It's judged in kitchens, bedrooms, and hallways, under warm bulbs, under shadows, and under those conditions, Andalusite looks restrained, sometimes even lifeless. So it failed the only test that mattered, the instant reaction. What changed wasn't the stone, it was attention. As collectors began looking beyond obvious brilliance, they started rotating stones, tilting them, examining them under different conditions. And Andalusite finally spoke. Color zoning appeared. Depth emerged. Warm and cool tones coexisted in a way few stones can replicate. Suddenly, a gemstone that had been ignored for decades gained a new audience. Not because it was trendy, but because it rewarded patience. But by then, most of it was gone. Here's the uncomfortable part. Andalusite didn't disappear from American homes because it was rare or fragile. It disappeared because people didn't look twice. They trusted first impressions. They trusted poor lighting. They trusted a single moment. Jewelry boxes were emptied. Estate pieces were cleared. Stones moved on, not because they were worthless, but because they were misunderstood. Andalusite belongs on this list because it reveals a mistake that has nothing to do with expertise, confusing immediacy with truth. Some gemstones aren't meant to impress instantly. They're meant to unfold. And when value requires patience, it's often the first thing people throw away. Some stones don't reward speed. Ranked third, Star Sapphire, the stone Americans threw away because they thought it was scratched. The line moved, and that's when they decided something was wrong. Someone picked it up, turned it under the light, saw a pale line across the surface, and made a decision. This one's scratched. That single assumption ended the story for countless real gemstones. Star sapphires were set aside, sold cheaply, or discarded entirely. Not because they lacked beauty, but because people misunderstood what they were seeing. Modern jewelry culture trains us to avoid flaws. Scratches mean damage. Damage means loss of value. So when a sapphire showed a line, especially one that moved oddly under light, people assumed something had gone wrong. They didn't wait. They didn't test. They didn't tilt the stone again. They let it go. Here's what most people didn't know. That scratch wasn't damage at all. It was the feature. Star sapphires contain microscopic, needle-like inclusions arranged in precise directions. When light hits the surface just right, those needles reflect it back as a star, usually with 6 rays, sometimes more. And here's the key detail most Americans missed. The star moves, tilt the stone, and the lines shift. Change the light, and the star follows. To someone unfamiliar, that movement feels wrong, artificial, almost suspicious. So people trusted their instincts, and their instincts were wrong. Across the U.S., star sapphires passed through hands quietly, rings inherited from grandparents, pendants from the mid-20th century, pieces that didn't sparkle like modern stones and didn't photograph well. They looked dull, opaque, unimpressive, until the light hit them correctly. But that moment rarely happened. Jewelry boxes were cleared under ceiling lights. Estate lots were sorted quickly. Pawn shop counters favored brilliance over behavior, and star sapphires lost every time. What changed wasn't discovery, it was patience. Collectors began looking for movement instead of shine. They rotated stones slowly. They tested them under a single point of light, and suddenly the stones people thought were damaged revealed something rare. Not polish, not clarity, but structure. A star sapphire doesn't perform on command. It responds to attention. Once that understanding spread, values shifted. Fine star sapphires, especially untreated ones with sharp, centered stars, became increasingly difficult to find. Not because they were never there, but because so many had already been thrown away. Here's the part that hurts. Star sapphires didn't disappear from American homes because they were fake. They disappeared because people confused evidence of formation with evidence of damage. They mistook geology for a flaw, and that mistake erased value quietly, one jewelry box at a time. Star sapphire belongs this high on the list because it exposes a simple truth. Some gemstones only reveal themselves when you slow down, and when patience disappears, value often goes with it. Once people learned to look for movement instead of shine, the mistake became obvious. Ranked second, unheated blue zircon. The stone Americans sold right before it was taken seriously. This one wasn't thrown away. It was sold too early. It sat in rings and pendants for decades, appreciated but never protected. When the time came to downsize, clean out, or simplify, blue zircon felt like an easy decision. It wasn't a diamond. It wasn't a sapphire. It wasn't something people thought would change. So it went first. Unheated blue zircon was often described as pretty, but not important. Bright enough to enjoy, common enough to replace, and that assumption quietly erased it from American collections. Here's why. For much of the 20th century, blue zircon lived in an uncomfortable space. It was real. It was natural. It was beautiful. But it didn't have prestige. Zircon had already been damaged by association. The name reminded people of cubic zirconia, even when the stone predated it by decades. So even fine blue zircon, crisp color, sharp brilliance, old cuts, was treated as secondary. When families sold jewelry, zircon didn't get a second thought. This one's nice, but not valuable. We can let this go. And so they did. What most people didn't realize is that fine blue zircon, especially unheated stones, was already becoming scarce. Natural blue zircon forms under specific conditions. Heat treatment can enhance color, but it also erases subtle characteristics collectors care about. Dispersion behavior, internal zoning, and stability tied to age. Older unheated stones carried those traits quietly, invisible to most people, but obvious once you knew what to look for. The problem was timing. For years, zircon was overshadowed by sapphire. As sapphire prices climbed out of reach, collectors began looking sideways. Not down, but around. And blue zircon was waiting. Its brilliance rivaled diamond. Its color held depth without treatment. Its supply, especially unheated examples, was far smaller than people assumed. By the time attention arrived, most American-held pieces were already gone, sold at estate sales, grouped into mixed lots, priced as nice but replaceable, but they weren't replaceable. Here's the part that hurts most. Unheated blue zircon didn't disappear because people thought it was fake. It disappeared because people thought it would always be there. They assumed there would be more. They assumed demand wouldn't change. They assumed value was stable. So they sold it, calmly, confidently, right before the shift. Today, fine unheated blue zircon is actively sought by collectors who understand what was lost. Older stones, early cuts, natural color untouched by heat, and American homes don't have many left. Zircon didn't teach people the danger of ignorance. It taught them the danger of timing. Sometimes value doesn't disappear suddenly. It leaves quietly, one easy decision at a time. That's why unheated blue zircon belongs this high on the list. Not because Americans didn't recognize it, but because they recognized it too early, before they understood where it was headed. It felt safe to let go, right up until it wasn't. In first place, vintage Spinel. The stone Americans let go because they thought they knew better. You let this go because you thought you already understood it. It sat quietly next to rubies and sapphires for generations. Similar in color, similar in size, similar in setting. Too similar. So when people inherited rings, evaluated old collections, or sold jewelry they no longer wore, Spinel was treated as the lesser option. Not ruby, not sapphire, probably garnet. And once that thought settled in, the decision was easy. Spinel was the stone Americans let go of because they thought they already understood it. They didn't test it. They didn't question it. They didn't wait. They assumed. For decades, red Spinel lived under the shadow of ruby. Blue Spinel lived unnoticed beside sapphire. The stones shared brilliance and clarity, sometimes even surpassing the stones they were compared to, but lacked the name recognition. And in American culture, names matter. Ruby means value. Sapphire means legacy. Spinel meant nothing. So vintage Spinel was sold cheaply, grouped into mixed lots, passed over at estate sales. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it didn't carry prestige. Here's what most people didn't know. Spinel is naturally colored. It doesn't rely on heat to improve appearance. Its reds stay red. Its blues stay blue. Cobalt blue Spinel, in particular, forms under extraordinarily narrow conditions. Conditions that nature rarely repeats. There is no large supply waiting to be discovered. There never was. But for much of the 20th century, that didn't matter. Because Spinel was judged by comparison. And comparison killed it. What changed wasn't the stone. It was language. As gemology corrected long-standing misidentifications, as collectors revisited older pieces with fresh eyes, Spinel finally separated itself from the shadows it had lived in. And the realization hit hard. Some of the finest ruby alternatives weren't alternatives at all. They were Spinel, rare, untreated, and quietly superior in stability. By the time that understanding spread, most American-held examples were already gone, sold decades earlier, priced as secondary, let go without regret, because no one thought there would be regret, but now there is. Vintage Spinel didn't disappear because Americans didn't recognize beauty. It disappeared because Americans trusted hierarchy. They believed value was fixed, that the order of importance wouldn't change, that what mattered yesterday would always matter tomorrow. Spinel proved otherwise, and that's why it belongs at number 1. Not because it was the rarest stone on this list, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it reveals the most uncomfortable truth of all. Sometimes the biggest losses don't come from ignorance. They come from confidence, from thinking we already know what matters. So here's the final question I want you to answer, and think about carefully. What have you already decided isn't worth keeping, simply because you think you understand it? By the time these stones were understood, most of them were already gone. Not because anyone was careless, but because they looked ordinary at the wrong moment. Some were sold too early, some were misnamed, some were never looked at twice, and that's the quiet pattern behind this list. Before you leave, tell us which stones surprised you the most. And if this made you pause before letting something go, then this story already changed something. We'll see you next time.